Okay. In the interest of time, we want to be respectful of everyone's schedules. We'll kick things off. So hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Selah Goodson-Bell, and I am a second-year research associate at the Environmental Law Institute. I'm also the program coordinator for the International Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement, or INECE. We're very thrilled to see how much interest this topic has garnered as more of you trickle in. As you know, today's program will offer an introduction to the ways that data analytics are being used by environmental compliance and enforcement agencies throughout the Americas. We expect this conversation to provide insights into how data analytics are being deployed, how data analytics can be used by agencies, and what information sharing and training may assist in enabling broader use of data analytics to achieve desired environmental outcomes. I'm going to introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our amazing panelists before we transition into a series of brief presentations on the topic. We will follow that up with a moderated discussion of the issues at hand. And we encourage you to ask questions throughout the program by sending them in the Q&A portion of the chat. If you post these in the chat box, I will also be able to see those, but please try and use the Q&A box. We hope to cover as many of your questions as possible. Apologies that it's loud outside. We hope to cover as many of your questions as possible during the moderated discussion, and we'll conclude with a few closing remarks from Lee Paddock, the Managing Director of INECE. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a moderator for today, and his name is Michael Enns. Michael graduated from the University of Ottawa's Criminology program with a master's in applied criminology, having completed his honors degree in criminology, magna cum laude. Upon graduation in 2008, he joined Environment Canada, where he worked directly with the Government of Canada officials and Indigenous governments to develop and implement the environmental portions of modern treaties and self-government agreements. Michael then worked for 3 years in international affairs. During this time, he was Canada's lead negotiator for the accountability and compliance elements of negotiations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Michael went on to become a senior advisor to 3 of Environment Canada's deputy ministers, where he was involved in all major departmental initiatives. Currently, Michael is Environment and Climate Change Canada's Director General of Risk Analysis within the department's enforcement branch. This group is responsible for identifying non-compliance and is the greatest threat to Canada's environment and wildlife, and ensuring departmental resources are targeted to reduce such risks. Michael continues to live in Ottawa with his wife, Molly, and son, James. Michael, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, thanks, Selah. And that noise in the background sounded a bit like a wolf outside your window there, so I hope everything's okay there.
Everything is good. Just ambulance.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And I do have the honor of introducing a very distinguished panel here, which I will do before we turn to the presentations. And then I believe the idea is that each of the presentations will go through. If there's any clarification questions that folks need to ask throughout, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll try to address all of the questions during the Q&A session that follows. So first up, we have Christian Diaz of the Peruvian government. He is the Director of Environmental Supervision of Infrastructure and Services in Peru's Agency for Environmental Assessment and Enforcement. He's held a series of positions in the Peruvian government focused on both international and domestic environmental issues, and he has experience in constitutional, administrative, municipal, and regional law. Very lucky to have Christian here. Welcome. We also have Francisco Donoso of the Chilean government. He leads the Environmental Intelligence Department at Chile's Superintendent of the Environment. He brings more than 10 years of experience in this role in analytics and economics applied to environmental policy. For the past 3 years, he's been promoting a new data-based approach to enhance environmental inspections and follow-up actions. He holds a master's degree in environmental protection and a Bachelor of Science degree in engineering. Welcome, Francisco. And last, but certainly not least, we have Randy Hill of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. He's the Director of Enforcement Targeting and Data Division in the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance. Randy and his very talented team oversee the development and operation of the EPA's major data systems for monitoring compliance and enforcement activities. He is also responsible for developing tools and techniques for identifying potential non-compliance with environmental laws, including the use of AI and data analytics. Randy has had a distinguished career in the EPA and held several senior executive positions in the areas of enforcement, water quality protection, and international and tribal affairs. So we have a very good panel for this discussion. I will now jump into my presentation and then the others will follow. We'll try to keep it to 7 or 8 minutes for each presentation to leave the maximum amount of time for discussion. Next slide, please. So this is just an overview of what we do at Environment and Climate Change Canada with respect to risk-based enforcement. So we are looking to identify the highest risk offenses always, which for us really means those that have an environmental or a conservation significance to them when they do occur. And we also look at the likelihood and the probability of them occurring, which together is what we consider to be a higher risk type of offense. We use a variety of data analytic tools to help us make those determinations, and I'll go through some of those as part of my presentation. The most important element, and I'll return to this though, is the feedback loop that we try to put in place, which means we use data science and intelligence and risk analytics to try to identify where we think the worst offenses will happen, but we always strive to verify whether or not our predictions are accurate in the field and then modify our approach going forward. And it's really that continual modification of our approach that we think leads to the best possible outcomes. Next slide, please. Just a quick snapshot of our department. So we have about 265 active, fully designated officers for our mandate across the country of Canada. And our mandate applies everywhere in the country. That you see some salary and budget information there. Our officers have the powers and protections of peace officers when they're enforcing Environment Canada's laws and regulations, which means they can conduct inspections, do investigations, and take a variety of different kinds of enforcement action in response to non-compliance, including recommending prosecution. Next slide, please. So this just gives a very kind of rough overview of what our mandate looks like. On the environmental, human health, sometimes the pollution side, you see the variety of different things where we have laws and regulations to guide behavior with respect to those things. On the wildlife side, it may look like less bullet points, but I assure you it is as deep and complex and an area as the pollution side. We have some federal protected habitats, and we look at both domestic and international species at risk, including with respect to migratory birds, which is an important element of our mandate on the wildlife side. Next slide, please. So I won't go through this word by word, but we do try to integrate data science into other areas of priority setting and expertise that we have in the department. And it's really when we bring all of these things together that we do the best work that we're capable of, in my view. So we have a tremendous scientific depth of knowledge in Environment and Climate Change Canada. We try to bring that together with predictive elements that help us to determine where offenses are likely to occur. And then we mesh that together with scientific information to try to define what is the environmental or conservation impact of those things. And those two things together help us to set the risk. And then of course we have to then consider what it means to do enforcement action in the field. And for those of you that are interested in this area, taking things from a theoretical risk-based analysis standpoint to things you can actually get done effectively in the field is a challenging thing to do. And we are working on that even as we speak, trying to find ways to make our mandate and the tools available to us as enforcement officers the most effective as possible in pursuing responses to those risks. That's a challenging area. And I can speak more to that if folks are interested. Next slide, please. So this is our famous feedback model that I referenced earlier. It's not a complex idea, but it can be complicated to put into practice. The idea is that we model risk with explicit and weighted indicators. So we use data science, including AI and machine learning, to try to define the probability of different kinds of non-compliant events happening and match that with the level of harm that is done when an offense occurs. And then we continually adjust those over time based on what we learn in the field. So you see that there's some weightings there. These are just examples, 1, 0.5, 0.06, 0.02. When we go in the field and we verify whether or not the predictions that we've made using data analytic tools are supported or not supported, we continually modify the weighting of those things to improve our predictions in the future. And I would say, hands down, that is the most important element of our approach, is the continual improvement and the focus on endlessly modifying our approach and never considering ourselves done as we continue to refine our efforts. I know I'm moving quickly, but we can follow up on any of these points in the Q&As. Next slide, please. So this just gives you a sense of the variety of different ways that we use data science in Environment and Climate Change Canada. So predictive analytics, when we're trying to use AI and machine learning to better predict where events that have happened previously will happen again in the future. And we use financial information, use geospatial analysis there, and GBA plus analysis as well, which is gender-based analysis, which is bringing some of the social science considerations and gender and race considerations into our predictive analytics. We look a lot, because we're the federal government, we look a lot at import and export of elements, and we use a variety of different tools to do there. SNA stands for social network analysis, where we're looking at what's happening online, which is increasingly important for the exchange of illegal goods. We look at all of the information that is brought in as part of commercial trade information when companies register to import or export goods from Canada, and a variety of other things. And then data science also helps us to make a direct contribution to the inspection process in the field by looking at route optimization, for example. It is expensive to send officers out in the field to physically inspect things, and we want to make the best possible use of their time. So it's sort of a funny comparison, but when you think about someone that works for FedEx or whatever, delivering packages, they take the most optimal route to deliver those things. And it's also possible to do that from an inspection standpoint if you think about the risk of offenses. So that's an exciting area that we're pursuing as well. Next slide, please. A couple of examples of some of the things that we've done from a predictive standpoint. We looked at the 60-month rate of return of a variety of larger enterprises within Canada. And what we found was that 60-month rate of return on investment is a good predictor of non-compliance, either when the 60-month rate of return is low or when the 60-month rate of return is high. So we have, for example, companies that are their 60-month rate of return is low, and so they are cutting corners potentially, and the probability of non-compliance goes up. Interestingly, if the 60-month rate of return is very high and they're going like gangbusters because they have big orders in that they're trying to fill, the probability of non-compliance can also go up because, you know, we assume machinery is being pushed beyond its limit, new people that are not as well trained are being brought in, and everyone is pushing the system to move beyond what its limit is to fill an order. Environmental accidents and non-compliance become more probable. It's just one aspect of our data analytics program, but it's proving to be quite useful as a predictive tool. Next slide, please. Another thing that we are doing is trying to match up where our regulatees are located with ongoing information that we have about degrading water bodies. So we monitor water quality and water quantity in a variety of different ways in Canada. And we, in particular, monitor water bodies and rivers and streams that the quality of the water is decreasing. So if we are able to match up the decreasing quality of the environment as an indicator of the water quality with the location of regulatees, we can begin to focus inspection efforts where we're seeing the greatest levels of environmental damage. This is work we've just started doing, but it involves big data sets that have been curated over the course of years, and matching those up with geolocation indicators, and then planning a route for inspection. So it's a one that we're pretty hopeful of. Just getting going, but potentially very high yields in terms of reduced non-compliance there. Next slide, please. And again, this is another one, and then I believe I will wrap up very quickly after that and turn the floor over to my colleagues. Supply chain networks, I think, are very interesting right now. We've seen them disrupted even before the pandemic. We saw the pandemic change things yet again in very significant ways. If you are a federal government doing environmental enforcement and your mandate includes the import and export of products from into and out of your country, supply chains are a very pertinent area in my mind. You want to be able to gather the information about where goods are originating and then how they move in and out of the country at the maximum number of points is my view. Which allows you, when you do an inspection and you find non-compliance at any point along that supply chain, you know that you need to be looking at connecting elements of that supply chain for compliance issues. And AI and machine learning tools, I'm pretty sure, are the only means by which you can keep up with the changing nature of supply chains and have any hope of a coherent targeting strategy to come up with that. So very exciting area here also that I'm happy to talk about. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, continual improvement is really the name of the game for Environment and Climate Change Canada. It is impossible to predict with 100% accuracy anything. It's certainly impossible when you first start out. The only means to do it is to learn from your mistakes and to have a system in place that is easily modified to improve. One of the best ways that I have found to do that is to collaborate through bodies like INECE in workshops like this one. And I'm very happy that INECE chose to support us in developing a data science working group, which is made up of government officials from around the world focused on data science and its use in environmental and conservation enforcement. And it's a great group with a lot of really talented and ambitious people. And it's very informal, and it's about exchanging ideas for the purposes of doing our jobs better together, which is a nice idea if you ask me. So I've put my email address there in blue type. Anyone interested is welcome to contact me, and I hope at least some of you do. With that, I am going to turn over the presentation and the floor to my colleague Christiane, and then we'll come back for the Q&A after the remaining presentations are done. So thank you so much for listening, and Christiane, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the event organizers and the audience. I would also like to meet my colleagues. Well, I am the Director of Environmental Supervision Infrastructure and Services of UEFA, and I would like to expose a brief presentation on the work we do on information management and certification of the processes of our organization. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide shows how WEFA's work as an environmental protection agency in Peru. We can see some news from Peruvian newspapers and also describing social environmental problems. First, recently split off the coast of Lima, great concern. This is still a motive for social environmental conflict. We also see a news item about citizen concern regarding the burning of sugarcane in Peru. Peru is a region in the north of the country, and the impact of the air pollution for the burning of sugarcane. And this news allows us to affirm that there is a challenging context for OFS work. And then one is due to the critical situation of environmental quality in Peru, both in terms of air, soil, and water. Otherwise, ineffective policies, for example, in oil industry, and that were implemented without information, generated the development of reactive approaches in the public management of environmental issues.
Christian, I'm sorry to interrupt. If there's any way you could just speak a little louder, that would be very helpful for folks online here. Thanks and apologies for the interruption.
No problem. Just give me a minute, please. Hello, I think it's better.
Yeah, that's better. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks,
Okay.
Christian.
Thank you. Okay. This news allows us to affirm that there is a challenging context for OFS work. On one hand, is due to the critical situation of environmental quality in Peru, both in terms of air, soil, and water. And likewise, ineffective policies that were implemented without information of the reality generated the development of reactive approaches in the public management of environmental issues. There is several structural problems in Peru, which make the proliferation of social environmental conflicts that affect citizenship. And this is the context of our work as an environmental protect agency. I think this is necessary to know before to check this item. Next slide, please. What was the OFS strategy to fulfill its function in this context? I think we have three priorities aspects: optimizing process, integrating information, and a territorial approach to developing our actions. The first involved optimizing that organization process with the help of German international cooperation, evaluating our procedures, improving them, standardizing our processes, and implementing the activities necessary to achieve the organization objectives. The second pillar was evaluating and developing tools that allow us to integrate the information we generate into OFS processes. And the third pillar was of our strategy has been to adopt a territorial approach to prioritize the areas to be supervised and the evaluation of the results of the supervisions. To this end, profiles of the country's different regions have been drawn up to determine the level of environmental risk in each of them. With this information, prioritize the companies that we supervise. I want to explain to you every point in the next slide. Next slide, please. Well, in this slide, we can see the procedure to approve a simple report. An exciting aspect of the process of optimization was discovering all the flaws in OFS supervision procedures that impacted the reality and the value of the information. For example, it was found that different supervision teams had other activities for the approval of supervision reports. There was no standard number of steps. This led to each group having its own database. In this figure, we can see a graph that shows the path that different teams follow in approving a single supervision report, the content of which was not incorporated into any best are used for any decision making. In that sense, what mattered was to get that document out and have one more supervision. Next slide, please. Well, this slide summarizes the process that we have followed to optimize the supervision process. A key aspect was creating a centralized team of people to analyze, control, and verify information. This made it possible to monitor the progress of the process and use of the data analysis to evaluate our organization. Once this was completed, the supervision teams evaluated the effectiveness of their actions. With this, they began to design and apply new legal tools to improve compliance with their obligations, such as agreements with the companies, so they voluntarily implement control measures. The evaluation of the supervisions allowed to design new strategies to improve compliance with environmental regulations. Next slide, please. The second pillar was the adopting a territorial approach to prioritize the areas in which the companies to be supervised are located. To do this, we use information compared by different Peruvian authorities. However, we had a problem. The lack of a single database in Peru that consolidates all the environmental information on beach, bays, watersheds, river, air quality, solid waste, management, and other ecological aspects. To this end, it was necessary to use physical documents, collect the information to sample a database of environmental information external to Earth. The objective of this work was to eliminate the bias of paying excessive attention to those areas repeatedly visited by UEFA, for which it has more information. Next slide, please. This sheet shows how applying the methodology allows prioritizing geographic areas with a severe environmental risk. That is districts with poor environmental quality. In these areas, the companies and factories to be supervised were prioritized, including obviously the information on each unit. Once the supervision has been completed, the aim was to evaluate the impact of the controls on environmental quality. This methodology brings some benefits. Eliminates subjectivity and biases in the choice and companies to be supervised. Next, please. Next slide, please. As a result, we obtain our ranking of the areas according to the environmental quality in Peru. We can see approximately 43.5% of the districts of Peru have a critical or severe environmental quality situation, which implies a need for effective public policies and concrete actions. This information is helpful for decision making in OEFA, the Ministry of Environment, and the other environmental control entities. It has been documented in our annual plan, but we hope in the future it will serve as mandatory starting point for government action in the years to come. Next slide, please. And the last pillar of our strategy has been the integration of information. During the optimization of processes and adopting a territorial approach, it became necessary to consolidate all the data generated by OEFA. A key aspect of organizing the information is to have an adequate conceptual framework process. This was built from the experience of the supervision teams. It was done to extend the processes were ordered and the traceability of the action was sought to identify the productivity and efficiency of activities. In this sheet, I present the value chain that guides the work of OEFA, which starts from the resources and materials, continues with the activity of OEFA, such as supervision, assessment, and sanction, includes tangible products such as reports, agreements, resolutions, reaches the level of compliance with environmental obligations in charge of companies, and leads to the final impact on the environmental quality of a particular area. This method is revolutionary in Peru already, to the extent that the institution adopt a public management approach that privileges the generation products, tangible products, rather than improving compliance with the law or citizens' quality of life. Next slide, please. There was a need to define basic categories in ordering the information. At the beginning, it was chaos. For example, work teams have different names for the same machines or mining companies. Thus, definition of unique components, monetary points, unit, obligation had to be established. This work was recorded in documents assigning responsibility for information and management. This work made it possible to build a tool that contains all the information in the supervision of a company called INECE. In the picture, we can see the imagine of this tool used by supervision companies. Basically, it's a use tool for us. Next slide, please. I think I have 8 minutes. Yeah, okay. Based on the integration of information, several channels have been developed to meet the needs of qualified stakeholders, citizens, and companies. One of them is a document management system that allows the submission and processing of documents for the supervision authority at any time and location. Is common. Another tool is a registry of environmental complaints, that allows the presentation and follow-up of citizen complaints about ecological problems. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to present the PIFA. It's an essential tool which contains all the information generated in the different processes of supervision, assessment, section, and every process in OEFA. This tool also contains statistical bulletins that are presented to citizens, civil society, business associations, and government authorities. Well, finally, I would like to comment that this presentation has tried to summarize the general lines of the work, however, but we have a special group that they are working about in this kind of data analysis. If you want more information about that, I will be happy to channel your request for this time for this team, sir. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Christian. I believe Francisco, you will be next. As you can see here, Francisco is the coordinator of the Environmental Intelligence section in Chile's Superintendency of the Environment. Again, thank you to those of you who have submitted questions so far. We're keeping track. Feel free to use the Q&A box or put them in the chat, and we'll get to them later on in the program. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Are you listening to me?
Yeah, we hear you well. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yep, next slide, please. Thank you for the invitation. I am Francisco Donoso. I work in Superintendents of Environment here in Chile. And my presentation, I titled Data Analytics to Support Environmental Regulation, SMA's Environmental Intelligence Strategy. Next, please. So my first slide is what is SMA? Superintendents of Environment is a Chilean agency for environmental compliance and enforcement, and our mission is to protect environmental people's health, ensuring Chilean environmental regulation compliance. And what kind of activity we do? It's monitoring, enforcement, sanction, and communication. Next, please. So what is our challenge, our main challenge? We have more than 60,000 facility to be inspected. As you can see in the left side of the slide, every red dot is a facility that can be inspected for us. And we have to analyze 60 national standards and more than 70,000 environmental permits. And also, we receive around 6,000 environmental complaints from citizens per year. So on the other hand, we have around 50 environmental inspectors nationwide. So as you can see, it's quite unbalanced between demand and the capacity of SMA. And that is the reason we think and we believe that data analytics is not a whim, it's a necessity for the institution, because it can give us some additional capacities to do more action and save life and try to care the environment in general. So data analytics can prompt to environmental compliance and enforcement. We don't have to forget our two main objectives, that the environmental damage does not occur in a preventive way. That is the best result for us. And second one, if it happens, it is detected on time. And we believe that data analytics can do that. Next slide, please. So that is the reason, and in this context, we create an environmental intelligence strategy. That is a document that can be downloaded from our webpage, of course in Spanish, so that with a good translator, you can get the main points. But I like this figure, and this figure is into the document, because the data is in the center of the diagram, and data come from different organizations and individuals, for example, regulated community, technical entities, citizenship, among others. So, and data can be captured, analyzed, and we can take some different actions, and those actions can benefit to the same organization and individuals, like a cycle. We call in that environmental intelligence strategy data intelligence platform, the process of data capture, analyze, and take action to do that. But what means action for us? And next slide, please. In the following fourth slide, I put some actions as examples. And the first one is the water emission standard compliance. I'm not going to explain in detail the standard, the water emission standard itself, because it's not the case, it's not useful for this presentation. But the idea here is trying to get the main idea. We automatize the whole process, the complete process, the verification, in order to get more result out of environmental outcomes from the data capture. And we pass to the analytic part, and we automatize enforcement reports and monthly compliance notification. We send to every facility, to each facility, what they are doing well, what they are not doing in a correct way. So we evaluate the process, and that is the graph that is below. And the green light represent the compliant firms or facility that is in a compliance, and the orange line is the opposite, not compliance. And it's possible to identify a breakpoint here, and that point that is the exact moment when we started to send the notifications. So that is a quite simple report and an evaluation. Then data analytics can improve a lot our standards. Next, please. My second example, it's a completely different example. It's about the compliance of fish farming CKH's enforcement. Fish farming is a quite big industry, especially salmon one. Actually, it's one of the biggest in the world. And the location of those fish farming, it's a very relevant point here in this country, but in this moment, because the location can imply in different impacts, because every fish farming have to be located in a specific way. And you can imagine that it's not possible to inspect everyone in on site. Yeah, there are examples here that an inspector can last around 2 days to reach only one that to do inspection on site. So we develop using a radar satellite imagery, actually using a Copernicus 1 to identify the location of everyone. So in the graph of below, it's possible to see the capacity of SMA now. The last year, we including the process and all the numbers represent the inspection reports per year. And in the last year, we increased a lot because that kind of development increased our capacity as institution. Next, please. So my third example about how data analytics have improved SMA actions is the real-time data to SMA. The IoT team in the SMA develop an AP REST system, and that implies that we can connect to many different regulated facilities, regulated community, and send us different kind of environmental variables. For example, emissions, or maybe water quality, air quality, operational variables. So we can understand the problem and we can check if they are fulfilling all their goals, all the environmental standards in the dashboard, that as example that I put in the slide in the below right. So we can see if they are crossing some threshold. So again, in the preventive way, we can understand the industry, we can understand if they are doing in a correct way or not. And finally, in the left slide, in the left graph, is an example of how we are increasing our facilities that are connected to SMA. We hope to this year we can reach around 1,000 facilities, but this number, I'm sure that it will be growing with the time. And final, yep, our for action, because of the time, I'm not going to explain in detail the process, but it's called prioritization of facility to inspect. As I mentioned before, SMA has more than 16,000 facilities to be inspected. So obviously it's not possible and it's not efficient to inspect everyone. But it's a decision that we have to take every year. Every year we have to choose which one should be inspected. And the relevant point in this example that we mix two approaches, different approaches. The first one is the approach come from math in general, using statistical modeling, databases, and a preference. We develop a preference survey, and we optimized all the process, and we get a list to be inspected, a list of facility to be inspected with that approach. But second, we don't have to forget all the knowledge that inspectors have joined with the pass of the year. So the idea here was create another list with all the knowledge of the people. And in the last stage, in the regional deliberative meetings, we mix and put together all the knowledge and get a final list to be inspected. So I think that, again, I'm not going to explain all the detail of the stages, but the main point here is that we can, everyone can help, analysts and people who knows a lot about the environment and the inspection enforcement in general. Next, please. So that is my last slide. What is next? In general, is to implement the environmental intelligence strategy. If you read the document, there are a lot of activities, initiatives that have to be done in the next year. and also strengthen data intelligence platform, data capture, analytics and action, massive and data analytics model and alerts in different environmental components. And we have a special focus on water and biodiversity variables related to climate change. And we have a very interesting project related to biodiversity, actually. And also feedback to environmental regulation. And because we think that all the analysis and data is not useful only for us as SMA, we can influence the environmental regulation. And that is a key point for us. And finally, again, we don't have to forget that is diffusion and community involvement. Oh, that is the link that you can download it, the document. So next, please. Only thank the opportunity to speak about this topic that I really like it, and I'm looking forward for any question that you have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Francisco. That was excellent, and the visuals in your presentation are stunning, including that last one. I'm thinking of planning a trip to Chile just based on those pictures alone. So, thank you so much, Randy. Can we turn it to you now, and then following your presentation, we'll hit the Q&A. We've got 5 good questions in there already, so looking forward to getting to those. Over to you, Randy. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I do want to thank ELI and INECE for this invitation. I had to rewrite what I was about to say literally during this presentation because about 20 minutes ago, the administrator of EPA sent out an email announcing his international environmental priorities in advance of the OECD Environmental Ministers Conference that starts tomorrow, and reminded EPA employees that we have a responsibility to work with the international community to protect the global commons. So I'm a big believer in webinars just like this. And I think as this webinar has already shown, that governments across America and indeed across the globe are addressing similar environmental problems with similar and yet unique and innovative solutions. And so I think this is incredibly timely. I also especially want to thank Michael Enns. He has been a leader in asking the question, how do we better use data and analytics for compliance and enforcement? And in fact, he has organized a community of practice among governments across the Americas and Europe, and this webinar kind of naturally comes out of that. So next slide, please. So EPA's compliance and enforcement program has been moving increasingly into the use of data analytics to support its efforts to identify noncompliance, target potential noncompliance for follow-up monitoring and inspections, and to characterize its activities for the public. I can't possibly cover all of this in 8 minutes, so I'll just provide a couple key examples. But this slide that's borrowed from the Gartner Group, a big IT consulting firm, shows the key steps that an organization goes through along the journey to being a strategic and data-driven organization. And I think our view of ourselves at EPA we are using the data well. We are proud of the key tools that we have. We're still on a bit of a pilot stage. Next slide, please. So my division at EPA is called the Enforcement Targeting and Data Division, and it's actually a name that describes very well our 2 main functions. EPA has somewhere north of 14,000 employees right now, and almost a fifth of those are involved with enforcement and compliance. We do handle the 10 major federal environmental statutes. Obviously, like Canada, we're a federal system. And lots of the non-compliance detection, especially on the civil side as opposed to criminal, is done via on-site inspection of regulated facilities. Before the pandemic, we were conducting about 10,000 inspections a year, but there are nearly 1.2 million regulated facilities at present. And obviously there's no chance that we can get to them all. Now, the 50 states and some local governments conduct inspections and enforce the key clean air, clean water, hazardous waste regulations, and the states do about 10 times as many inspections as EPA. But the system is still built on the efficient targeting of inspections, really finding the sites where noncompliance is most likely to occur. And this is where we've been most using predictive analytics. But we also do a lot of data management and integration of ambient data, compliance data, very similar to the information integration approach that Christian talked about in Peru. And our principal tool for doing so is also our principal tool for communicating with the public. The Enforcement and Compliance History Online, or ECHO website, echo.epa.gov. I commend it to you. Next slide, please. So as I said, we're beginning to use machine learning models to predict sites that are in non-compliance, principally as a targeting tool, a tool to identify where we will do follow-up on-site inspections. And in response to one of the questions in the chat, we've actually been working very closely with the academic community on this. We already have one such model in place for the hazardous waste law in the US, and we have similar models in development for clean air and clean water non-compliance. And these models, they're very similar to the type of model that Francisco talked about in terms of inspection prioritization, in that they take a variety of data sources, they use those to predict the probability that the facility is in non-compliance, and they generate a ranked list that we use to do, again, follow-up inspections. Next slide, please. So our RCRA model was developed in partnership with the University of Chicago. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The researchers at Chicago were very instrumental in doing this work for us. They built a random forest statistical model that examined 8,000 variables and 15 years of data to predict the likelihood of severe violations at what we call large quantity generators, basically industrial sites that are creating more than 1,000 kilograms of hazardous waste each month. And the basic result is that the model was 47% more likely to choose a site in severe violation than our more informal method that was essentially the best professional judgment of the inspector rather than something specifically analytic. So we think that that the power of this type of analytics has already been demonstrated. Next slide, please. Now, beyond predictive analytics, we are continuing to use simple statistics and especially GIS-based mapping tools to identify environmental hotspots and to compare those to regulated facilities. One such example is our ECHO Clean Air Tracking tool. I always throw an extra word in there. ECAT, because of course everything at EPA must be an acronym. And what ECAT does is precisely this type of GIS mapping. Now, I can't actually show it to you. Most of our targeting tools are available only to EPA employees and to employees of our partner state and local government compliance programs. But in a word, these tools simply take on and put into a single GIS graph data, or map really, data from ambient air monitoring information overlaid with potential sources of the detected pollutants. It's very similar in sort of look and feel to Francisco's sea cage enforcement slide that we saw earlier. But the idea is that you have dots that basically show where the sources are. You have dots that show where the air detections are, and you can sort of just literally eyeball where there may be potential problems. So it's simple, but it is data driven, and it is actually a very powerful graphical tool. And we have several of these in work right now. Next slide, please. Now, as I noted, the RIPRA predictive model was developed principally by researchers at the University of Chicago Energy and Environment Lab, who coded the model in R, tested it, worked with us to validate it using a randomized control trial. And in that trial, EPA inspectors inspected its sites rather, selected by the model versus sites that were selected by traditional professional judgment techniques. And that's how we got the result I quoted earlier. We are in the process of working with Chicago as well as Stanford on new such models I alluded to earlier, the clean air and clean water models. And we're also developing other, working a lot with the academic community on other uses of data to answer questions like how effective are warning letters as an enforcement technique. All this work is being done by a group within my division that's called the National Targeting Center. And the National Targeting Center is basically developing these tools and in particular working with our regional office, EPA regional offices, and soon with our partner states in various communities practice so we can identify additional targeting and inspection techniques and potentially socialize those nationally. Again, I think this is similar to what we've heard from the other panelists in terms of information dissemination of effective models. Next slide, please. I could talk about this all day, but I really tried to keep this within 8 minutes. I think I got pretty close. And as a result, I could only scratch the surface of our efforts. But we at EPA are absolutely convinced that big data and analytics are going to improve the efficiency of our compliance and enforcement efforts. We've already seen it. That in turn is going to increase the level of environmental compliance. And of course, the ultimate goal, as Christian said, is to protect human health and the environment in our respective countries. That's the goal. And we think these techniques will ultimately achieve it. Thanks very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Randy. That was great. And I really like that quote at the end, which sums things up beautifully. So thanks so much for that. So we have a number of questions in both the Q&A, and then I see some stuff popping up in the chat. Selah, unless you direct me differently, I'd suggest we just start working our way through the Q&A questions and take it from there. So if that's all right with you, that's what I'll do.
Yep, that sounds good, Mike. I think some of the questions are a little bit more specifically tailored to logistics in people's presentations. So if you get to one of those, I'll probably ask you to move on to the next one. So because those can be answered probably like separately, we can connect people after, but thank you. Yeah,
sure, Selah. And I see that there's a number of those questions and you're handling that, so that's great. The first one up here is a voice of experience, I have no doubt. It talked about some of the challenges of implementing the approaches that we have been talking about. In particular, it seems to me that it's getting at the question of the data that you have available. All enforcement agencies have a risk of going and doing inspections in only a narrow part of their mandate and focusing on the types of non-compliance that are most likely to occur rather than those that are most environmentally significant. And so I guess it was, maybe we can put this to whomever in the panel would like to answer, and then I have some thoughts on the matter at the end. But how do we get around the fact that some of our data sets can become skewed when certain types of offenses, because they're easier to detect and so forth, are focused on, and how do we make sure that that doesn't skew our data sets and take us away from what is ultimately more important, potentially from an environmental or conservation standpoint. Randy, can you kick us off on that one with any thoughts you might have? And then Francisco and Christina, you're welcome to come in as well.
Great, I get to start with the easy question. Huh?
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I mean, as I was thinking about it, I think part of the answer depends on the method by which non-compliance is determined in the first place. For instance, I think it was Francisco who talked about this, that he had this water monitoring technique. We have something very similar in the United States where most water discharge data comes from self-reported monitoring by the regulated community. And we have substantial amounts of that data as a result. And we're trying to make certain that it is complete and in a single place. One of our biggest issues is where it is collected by our states, getting that data transferred to EPA so it's in one place has been a challenge. But where you've got that much information, almost a census of current compliance, I think it's relatively easy to make certain that you're not skewing the results. Where you've got a program or a regulation that is largely based on inspections, as I said, for EPA, we target most of our inspections because we are really primarily a supplement to the state and local governments who do sort of the basic, randomized check on compliance. In that situation, I think you do need to be careful that you have integrated well all of the different sources, and that you have to have some confidence in your targeting or analytical method in the first place to make certain that you are looking across the board and not just where you were hoping to find a problem anyway.
Thanks, Randy. Francisco or Christian, did you have thoughts on this one, or? It's okay. So from my part, in Canada, what we did is essentially mandate ourselves to do a certain amount of inspections outside of the norm. So 10% of our inspections are essentially a sampling exercise where we deliberately go to areas of our mandate that we have not inspected as frequently as other areas. For the purposes of making sure our data set is as representative as possible, which allows us to feed that into what we analyze, and then what we consider to be highest risk is based on actual inspection data across the breadth of our mandate to the extent possible. So implementing that notion of a sampling exercise just for the purposes of gathering data can be challenging in an enforcement branch. Many enforcement officers did not sign up to go to places where they're not sure they're going to find non-compliance or not, and in fact so it's challenging. But if there is risk there, and if there is the potential, at least at all, for environmental non-compliance that's significant, we do try to intentionally inspect there as a matter of planning. So that's one of the ways that we handle that. So I'll roll into the next question, which comes from somebody that knows a thing or two about achieving regulatory excellence, I believe. It's a very good question. And it talks about what the difference between developing your data analytics capacity in-house versus using outside bodies to help you to do that, and finding the right balance for your organization and for the best outcomes. So maybe I could pose the question to the panel in a bit of a broader sense, but ask them to touch on that as well, is what does it take to get one of these programs up and running in your organization? What is necessary? What kind of training do you need to do? And as you develop your approaches, how do you draw from expertise outside, and what do you build in-house? So is there any member of the panel that would like to take that one on? I feel like giving Randy a break on this one. So, well, Francisco, did you have thoughts on how you developed a program in Chile?
Yeah. I think that we have a special challenge here. Because the training in our team, for example, our team is around 16 members, and we have a special problem with that because the capacity, as I said before, it's not enough for all the challenge that we have, and the training that we need is in many different areas. For example, all kind of analysis that using the big data analytics come from satellite imagery or maybe IoT systems. In my presentation, I showed how we expect that growing all the IoT system. So we don't have enough capacity, not only in the number of professionals here in SMA, and also the capacity of infrastructure to receive all that kind of data. We use, for example, Azure cloud computing, but obviously there are some resources about that. But also related to knowledge and related specifically to the kind of training that we need is not very related to data analytics. I think it's all the knowledge of behavioral change in general, because how we can prioritize different data analytics programs, it's trying to get, we need the results, we need the environmental outcomes. So if we can understand how the different facility behave, obviously we can prioritize in better way the different projects. So so I think that we have a lack in knowledge, or maybe a gap in knowledge in this area. The behavioral change is understanding and all the facility behavior, but in a psychological way maybe. And I think that that could be a very nice to know about that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Randy or Christiane, do you want to jump in here?
I think the only thing I'll say is to sort of follow up on what I said before, which is that we really did kind of aggressively, try to partner with especially the academic community. I have found that in the not quite 5 years that I have been in charge of this division, we have built a lot more in-house capacity just through the process of doing the project. And we hire a lot of scientists, engineers, environmental protection professionals. A lot of them are much better trained in statistics and analytics and frankly computer science than I ever was. And so it's just natural that we can bring more and more of it in-house. I mean, EPA has always relied on outside consulting firms, contractors to help us out. But what I find is that where we're most effective is where we have enough in-house expertise to at least be able to design and evaluate the projects, if not actually conduct them.
Thanks, Randy. So in my case, and in the case of Environment and Climate Change Canada, I really focused on building in-house capacity. So we did go through a process and continue to have a network of academics that we continually invite to review and scrutinize our models and our methods and the outcomes of our risk analysis to help us refine it. But the frameworks and the models and how we do the work is in-house, and the talent is there in-house. We also have a whole slew of other experts that we consult from time to time. But my sense is that has worked out pretty well for us. And I continue to believe one of the advantages of this approach is it's actually fairly low overhead. You don't need an army of people to do this work, to build in-house. For Environment and Climate Change Canada is we have the mandate that we do and the size of the country that we do. So it may not work in all cases, But I have a team of 2 senior data scientists who have a number of folks that work for them. And that has proved sufficient to do all of the work that we have done in terms of modeling, predictive analytics, targeting, route optimization. All of the things that we've done has been done by a very small group with low overhead. And that's one of the real advantages here. And that's one of the means by which it can be implemented in a variety of different jurisdictions. Like it is not heavy overhead stuff if it's done properly, in my mind, and it doesn't need to rely on outside expertise as a continual sort of crutch. But we, just as with the EPA mentioned, that ongoing relationship with those outside that can help you to continue to refine your tools, continue to refine your understanding, is a great asset if done in the right way. That's my particular view. One thing I'd add to it is conversations like this are actually, in my mind, the best means by which to continue to develop your data science capacity in-house. You will not find people facing more common problems than people that do data science and environmental enforcement wherever they are in the world. And I suspect Francisco and Christian and Randy and I have much more in common than we do with many of the colleagues that we work with in our own government, because of the nature of the problems that we're trying to face, which are fundamentally the same, right? Huge mandates, hugely complex forms of non-compliance, relatively few officers to go out and do that work, and the need to be efficient and the need to be highly targeted are there for everyone. And exchanges like this on the best way to do that are the most productive, in my view. So I hope that got at that question. We'll go on to the next. This one's for you, Francisco. Is every facility in Chile, have they installed the monitoring equipment and connected it to the data analysis that you mentioned during your presentation? So are those monitoring elements at every facility?
Yep. No. Never. It's not possible. It's quite costly in most of the cases. In general, the number of facility is around, as showed, around 400, but they are quite big facility in general, because their environmental permits you have to install, for example, an air quality monitoring in a specific place. So that is the data that we are receiving. So we said that data was necessary for the SMA, because the environmental permit says that it's not necessary to share it, only to have it. So SMA, in a legal innovation, I could say, that was okay, you send us the data now, but it's not possible to now from the SMA to say everyone have to install one. But the exception is when they're a firm or they're a facility that is we call compliance program. That is when it's in a sanction procedure, you can implement some additional devices that weren't specified in their environmental permit. So that is the reason why we don't have the 16,000 different facility connected. Only in general, it's only the big one, for example, power plants and other kind of that kind of industry in general.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to keep rolling here. There's a couple of fairly specific questions about formulas and so forth.
And
I'm going to skip over those. Yeah.
Quick question. I just wanted to know, there are a couple other questions in the chat that came in earlier. I want to make sure that we at least hit one of them since they were asked quite early on. Okay. Do you mind reading? Oh, I can read off the question and then you can provide a comment / direct the conversation from there. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. This is from Elizabeth Evele. Sorry if I mispronounced your last name, but Elizabeth asked, in terms of predictive analysis, has there been any research done on the effect of adaptive management and mitigation planning And getting a little bit more specific, in other words, might a strict requirement for escrow funds from project proponents to be reserved in the case of non-compliance serve to disincentivize violations?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm aware of research that gets directly at that question. I certainly understand where it's coming from. We do have something similar to escrow funds in Canada. For example, if you want to do large projects, or if you want to take ships through certain areas of our country, you have to demonstrate that you have the means by which you could address an environmental emergency should it happen. And then when environmental assessments are done in Canada, sometimes it's required for an organization to have a certain amount of money set aside for the long-term environmental management of the facility, even after it closes up, et cetera. This has the same issue that many measurement issues in the area of kind of non-compliance and crime have, which is how do you measure the probability of something that didn't happen, right? So it's very difficult to get at. We can look at the types of non-compliance that are committed by different companies, and from there extrapolate what the underlying reasons are that happened, and then do future targeting and hypothesis testing around that to determine what are the elements that an organization will take into account when it is considering how to do its business, what are the probability factors that would make an organization more or less likely to be non-compliant. But it only indirectly gets at your question, which is a very interesting one. So I invite any of the other panelists to add to that, but that's been my experience to date. Okay.
I think the only thing I will add is that, for instance, I mean, it's not exactly the same situation, but it's analogous. I mean, for instance, our U.S. hazardous waste regulations require basically set aside some form of financial assurance to ensure the sufficient closure and cleanup of a disposal facility, and we actually did. That was actually one of our enforcement priorities in the last decade, long actually before we had a lot of this data. It's an interesting question. I'm not aware of any specific research on it, but I think it's a good topic.
Absolutely. I bet you there's a student or two online that could take that up as a PhD piece. And if you decide to do that, I'll support you in any way I can. But that is a very, very tough one, but very pertinent to our work and means and gets right at the heart of what we're trying to do for sure. Sayla, do you want me to go back to the Q&A, or did you have another one from the chat you want us to take on?
You can, for the next one, you can go back to the Q&A, and then maybe after that, I'll pick another one from the chat.
Okay, gotcha.
Thank you.
So Randy, your number's up, unfortunately, for the next one. It's addressed to you here. It's about your comment around some of the work you've done on the effectiveness of warning letters. And this person just inviting you to speak a bit more about that.
I would love to. I actually can't say much more than I've already said. It's kind of an ongoing experiment that we have going, and so I don't want to. You know, we're doing it as a controlled experiment, so I don't want to bias the results too much. But we're basically testing the impact of essentially non-compliance reminders on compliance levels, and if we can get enough data, we're actually going to even look at kind of, you know, sort of the tone of the letter, you know, is something that says, hey, you know, we notice this versus the law doesn't allow you to do this. Does that have an impact? When we do have some results we can share, I'm excited to talk about it, but that's probably all I can say at this point.
Sure, and that's fair enough, Randy. Thank you for that. Just for interest, we've done a little bit of some similar type of work in Canada to look at warning letters and their effectiveness in reducing recidivism or the severity of recidivism. So if we go and do an inspection and find non-compliance and issue a warning letter. If we go back in a year or two's time, do we find non-compliance again? And if so, is it more or less severe than it was on the first go round? Warning letters have shown some promise in that study, which is ongoing as well, particularly with small and medium-sized enterprises. When you start talking about large enterprises, they have far less impact, has been our initial findings. So I hope that answers that. Selah, did you have one you wanted to read to the group?
Yes, this is from Felipe Parra. Thank you for using the chat and posing this question. Felipe said that it seems like a lot of environmental monitoring will rely on automated and remote equipment in the near future, as was talked about briefly in a couple of the presentations. Felipe is curious about what the decision-making process is like when choosing which equipment is being used by which agency, who decides what equipment is best, and who some of the best providers are. Just a little bit more curious about that process.
Sure. Maybe I'll kick it off for this one, and then others are welcome to come in. So this is a big topic of discussion, and at the moment, and COVID really accelerated some of the discussions, at least it did in Canada, when it was harder to safely move officers around to conduct inspections because of the restrictions and so forth. What became the subject of discussion very quickly is there remote means to do this? Can we use technology? Can we automate things in different ways? And those discussions are ongoing. There's a number of different things. So in terms of who decides what equipment to pick, I mean, for us in Canada, it's an internal decision of the enforcement branch. Of course, we're subject to all kinds of rules from our Treasury Board and so forth. And so it's finding a way through that path to get the tools that you need. A big question, of course, too, is, at least in Canada, is what is the expectation of privacy that a regulatee or an individual has, and what is your equipment working in conformity with those obligations. So if someone has an expectation of privacy and you're using electronic means to do an inspection and it violates that expectation of privacy, then that can be an issue. And that is an area that we're looking at and trying to make sure that our use of these tools and so forth pays due respect to those legal obligations that we have. And that's a big part of the discussion. The technology itself is flourishing as far as I can tell. And that's both the quality and the range of drones is getting better. Satellite imagery, including in some cases with thermal capacity, is getting better. And remote sensors that can monitor water bodies on an ongoing basis are getting better. Those are three pretty exciting areas. But you know, there is those various considerations that we all have to take into account as we think about how to use those. Would anyone else like to get in on that one from the panel?
Yep. For example, here in Chile, of course, there is a big question and a challenge decision. Everyone that we have to choose what kind of equipment we needed. And we, in the first place, we have to analyze if the time resolution, for example, it's according to what we need. Of course, the resolution of for example, if the equipment is measured in ppb or maybe in other higher resolution, so depend of the problem. Of course, if the equipment has, for example, the sensor has enough background of the use of that. And also, if there's enough, for example, if you are deploying an IoT system in a place, for example, if the equipment has internet connections and that kind of thing, it's not only the measure itself, it's the process to receive data. But here in in Chile, we don't have enough a developed industry to do that. in most of the cases we import everything, and with the of course with the higher cost that is possible to get, for example, United States. But I would say that in general that is the decision processing to choose those equipment. As Michael said, of course, the same idea imply in drones, use of drones and satellite imagery, because depend of the case, depend what we need to measure is the decision that we have according to choose the equipment.
Thanks. Anybody else before we jump to the next one? Okay. So I'll head back to the Q&A. So environmental enforcement is typically kind of a command and control approach that doesn't take into consideration human and institutional factors that are often the root cause of non-compliance. To what extent today are we looking at the ideas of just culture as opposed to this traditional approach, and how does data and analytics and so forth fit into that? Maybe I'll start again, if that's okay. So we have a compliance promotion program in our department that works with regulatees and so forth to help them understand the benefits as well as the penalties around non-compliance, and that is an important part of that. But more than that, we have started just recently to look at behavioral science as a means by which to influence and send our messages out to the population about the benefits of non-compliance. So what is it that is the most effective means by which to change behavior is the fundamental question there. And enforcement is seen as an element of that, but much more is possible, including looking at public communication through various different means, and looking at ways to motivate people to be in compliance with the laws and regulations, but also just to do more, right? To value in a healthy and clean environment, and to look at ways to advance that in their own life. So there's a lot of stuff happening. We still do rely on compliance and enforcement when it becomes necessary, of course. And behavioral economics or behavioral science is becoming increasingly a part of how we do environmental compliance as well. So, when we talk about warning letters, I am sure there is a way to draft that warning letter in taking into account the principles of behavioral science in such a way that you raise the likelihood of compliance, just as one very minor example. And those are things we're actively exploring now, at least from my perspective. Anybody else on that one from the panel?
I'll take a crack at this. I mean, we talk at US EPA a lot about the compliance toolbox, which is basically the methods that we have to promote and return facilities to compliance, and formal enforcement is a key part of the toolbox, not the only toolbox. I think that's one of the. One of the things that we are interested in is figuring out the effectiveness of various enforcement tools. I did allude to that a little bit in the study that I mentioned that we're working on. And I think that obviously an effective data model that's really good at predicting both non-compliance and severity of that non-compliance would be very helpful in sort of designing what would be the most effective tool. Would compliance assistance or compliance promotion or basically the advice or reminders, would that be sufficient to deal with a lot of situations? And we would obviously be very interested in the results of that research, because again, as I said, we can't possibly inspect and enforce against every potential facility. So we need to have a variety of tools available.
Right. I see my friend and colleague Lee Paddock has come out, which makes me think we may have run out of time. Is that the case, Lee? If so, I will sum this up and hand it over to you. Is that
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Michael. We are at our closing time. I first of all want to thank Michael and Randy and Francisco and Christian for an excellent set of presentations. This is obviously an important issue, and as Michael had indicated, we do have a community of practice in this area. Please do contact him if you're interested in participating. Thank you to all of those who attended. I just want to briefly mention that we have a lineup of INECE programs coming up over the next few months. Our next one will focus on environmental justice and looking at questions of how injunctive relief can advance environmental justice, how restorative justice concepts could come into play. That will be late spring, early summer. By the fall, we hope to be doing a program on citizen science technology, which technology came up a lot in this presentation, how citizens interface with enforcement officials with the technology they now have available is on our agenda. That will be followed by a program on enforcing existing greenhouse gas regulation programs and designing good greenhouse gas control programs so that they're enforceable. And we'll finish up the year with a program on environmental impact assessment enforcement, which I know is of interest to a number of folks on this call, and based on some of the work that has been done by the International Association for Impact Assessment. So thank you all. Please do stay in contact with INECE, and we look forward to seeing you at future programs. Goodbye now.